Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Carlos Padilla, and I help organize these events. I'd like to start off by thanking you all for joining us today. I'm very excited for today's presentations. My supervisor, Dr. Jill McDonald, who I help organize these events for, will not be able to join us today, and she sends her deepest apologies for not being here. But nonetheless, we have very exciting presentations regarding the Peace Corps. We'll first start off with Ryan McRoberts. So Ryan, if you want to start sharing your slides. And in the meantime, I just want to say in regards to questions, you can feel free to add them to the chat box or to raise your hand. I think there's a little indicator in the participant settings. So feel free to ask your questions during, in between the slides, or we'll also have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. So we'll start off with Ryan. So Ryan, if you want to share your slides now and just give a quick introduction.
Sure, just give me 1 second to get all set up. So while I am setting up, I am a current first year social work student at New Mexico State. Sorry, the faces are all in the way of the present button. And I'm also a returned Peace Corps volunteer. So I served from 2016, I went in September 2016 until mid-December 2019. So I left right before the pandemic hit. I was very lucky. And I also served as a Peace Corps volunteer leader, which is a little bit different than normal Peace Corps service or traditional Peace Corps service. And I can kind of talk a little bit about that during the presentation. But feel free to ask me any questions during, after. I don't know if anyone else wants to try to monitor the chat. I'll try to look at it whenever we get to the end, but for now, I'm not really going to keep my eyes on it for too long. But also, okay, so just to start too, I also volunteered in the youth and development sector. So there are 6 different sectors of Peace Corps, and mine was a little bit smaller and specific to kind of working on youth development. So let me go back 1 more second. Sorry about this. Okay, so to start off, what kind of work did I do while I was in the Peace Corps and with what communities? So Guatemala is a really, really small country that's right below Mexico. We have a lot of immigrants that are currently coming from Guatemala to the US that are stuck kind of in this transition, and you probably see a lot of things in the news about Guatemalans coming to and from. For me, the community I was in, it was in the northern Quiché region. So it's up in the mountains. It's about 8 hours from the capital city and via public transportation. And it was a primarily indigenous community. So it was a, 98.9% makeup of indigenous population. So it was either Quiché or Ixil, which meant that majority of the population didn't speak Spanish as a first language. It was their native tongue. So whether it's Quechí, Quiché, Cachiquel, Ixil, and there are approximately 24 languages spoken in Guatemala. So there's a plethora of areas to go and work and things to learn. For me, I was a youth and development coordinator. So I partnered with 2 local middle schools, the principals at their middle schools, and I implemented youth and development programming. These are a couple pictures of about a year in. I was able to work with students and kind of develop the rapport and get them to participate. Middle school is a really tough age, especially when they have to participate in a language that isn't their own. We have a hard time even now in the States getting middle schoolers to participate or share their thoughts and opinions. So when you're working on self-esteem or leadership, and having to do it in a foreign language because they're doing it in Spanish as opposed to Ixil, it was really, really difficult. And then the last year I worked as a Peace Corps volunteer leader. So I helped organize a lot of the trainings for Peace Corps volunteers that were coming in. So whether it was basic training that talked about what Peace Corps is, using different identities within the Peace Corps and integrating that into life in Guatemala, or just talking about what we do in the Youth and Development Project. I also trained kind of adults that work with youth in different forums and whatnot on all of these things, and even how to do project implementation and needs-based assessments, which was really, really fun. So here a little bit more about my actual job while I was there. So I would go into the classroom, work within a curriculum that was already established by the Department of Education in Guatemala to specialize in areas like leadership, decision-making, goal setting, team building, kind of all the hard and soft skills that students need to be successful in the workforce in Guatemala. In Guatemala, a lot of them will stop school after middle school. So I think it's about a 60% dropout rate from elementary school to middle school. And then after that, it's something like 80% dropout rate from middle school to high school. So if you can get them into middle school, we're really preparing them to go onto the workforce because of the amount of poverty and the lack of jobs and lack of job security that exists in the rural areas. I also worked on sexual and reproductive health. Unfortunately, they have high rates of kind of child marriages. It's a little bit better now. I think in 2016, they actually put a law in saying that you had to be 18 to be legally married. A lot of the villages kind of have their own laws that they will abide by instead of federal law. No one's really going to enforce the federal law in Guatemala. So I still had 16-year-olds that were getting married to 20, 30-something-year-old men, or kind of getting pregnant by their sweetheart. So we talked about what sexual and reproductive health looks like, what changes your body is going through, all that type of stuff, and even gender a little bit, which is different or difficult in I lived in a very evangelical community. So there is some, we would say choque, like little headbutting going on with ideals. And then I also helped develop a mental health curriculum. So while we were there, this is kind of relevant to, I guess, what's going on now in the US system. But while I was there, we noticed a huge need for mental health, work in mental health. The community I lived in was actually a model community during the Civil War. So it would be equated to potentially as a concentration camp during the Holocaust. So there were military that went in and were massacring indigenous members that were suspected to be working with guerrilla who were fighting the military. So for me, working with survivors or generations of survivors of that, there were a lot of mental health aspects that went into that, and making sure that children felt supported, they weren't talking to people online that they shouldn't have been talking to, and that they weren't drinking or doing drugs that they didn't necessarily, that they couldn't spend money on. So alcoholism was very, very prevalent in this community. So additionally, and apart from my day-to-day work with the youth and training, I also worked on MRE, so monitoring and evaluation committee, media committees, curriculum development committees. I also designed a youth and development curriculum for a nonprofit that's been in Guatemala, I want to say maybe 30 years at least, that has worked with younger kids and adults, but hadn't worked with middle and high school ages. So that was really, really cool. And we also developed diversity and inclusion training for Peace Corps volunteers. Going into a new culture is really, really difficult, especially if you've never left the US before. So it's really important to kind of train people on that before you go and you serve these communities. So what are some parallels between your experiences in the Peace Corps with what you're doing now or planning to do in the future? So this is kind of up in the air for me. But at least currently, some things that I learned in the Peace Corps that helped me with where I am in my social work program. We had a huge focus on different ways to implement kind of strengths-based perspectives, trauma-informed practices. One of the big things that Peace Corps has developed is a participatory action for community analysis. We refer to it as PACA, the asset-based community development programs, culturally informed practices, and trauma-informed practices. The biggest thing is, if anyone's familiar with the term white saviorism, as a white person going into a developing nation, there is a lot of area for me to do a lot of harm. So what these programs aim to do is involve the community and actors in the community to help figure out solutions that already exist in the community and really highlight those and bring them to the surface so that there's sustainable change. And for me as a social worker, this is extremely prevalent. Historically speaking, social work has kind of had its ups and downs with what working in communities looks like, and whether or not we're actually helping communities, especially if we look at New Mexico. We look at what's going on with Indigenous populations, what social workers are doing in the past, what happens when you're taking children away from their families. Is that really best practice? Is it not? So these are all tools that I hadn't even really been aware of would be impacting me before I decided to pursue social work. But I think all of these are really relevant no matter where you go, what you're doing, especially moving. I use them whenever I move across country or to a different country. I'm originally from the East Coast and I moved to New Mexico and still learning my community here in a pandemic. So I found all of these give me a good basis of kind of understanding where I'm at and what exists and what impact I can create with what already exists in the area that I'm working in. So what public health or social issues in the region or area do you feel suitable to address based off of my experiences in the Peace Corps? To preface this, I don't think, so I don't think that Peace Corps makes anyone an expert in any area. As I'm sure, I believe Chris is probably going to share, everyone's Peace Corps service is different. I have a sister that served in Tanzania, and the things that she was looking at were very different than what I looked at from Guatemala. I had the issues of immigration, kind of sexual exploitation of children, human trafficking that weren't necessarily happening like they do in close relation to the US and Tanzania. And majority of volunteers don't volunteer in Latin America. But those are different areas or different things to keep in mind, that everyone's story is different. But in relating it to how it's impacting how I'm working here, there are a couple areas that I have noticed through using the different tools and kind of assessing the community through the social work perspective. One of the projects that we're working on right now is on border health studies. So I'm working, sorry, I have a fly in my room. I'm working on a project with the director of the social work school, just because I am a graduate research assistant, and we are working on kind of measuring human capital and social capital within the area and how that impacts human development. We want to do that through measuring programming that NGOs and nonprofit partnerships provide. So we aren't necessarily going to go in and develop something completely new from an outside perspective. We're looking to partner with organizations that are already implementing programs and measuring how this is impacting locals, both in Mexico and in the US, and see if there are similarities or differences. Additionally, another thing I've noticed, I'm currently in a field practicum based in the schools. So most of this time I've been working as a SPED social worker, so special education social worker, in 2 local elementary schools. We've seen a plethora of kind of disadvantages in areas for work. If you're familiar at all with kind of the legislation that goes into school environments, New Mexico is lacking. It's lacking in many areas. Unfortunately, they have a lot to offer, but we are ranked 50th, and we have been ranked in the lower 48th to 50th rank for the last couple of years now in terms of youth development and youth programming. And overall, what would be the word for that? I will just say youth development, youth programming in general. So looking at this, there has been a lot of push for use of outdoor classrooms, cost-effective resilience building programs, kind of career development programs outside of outside school programming, things that youth can actually use that will benefit them and serve them as they transition into adulthood. So for me, I am really interested in kind of with the programming background and someone who has done a lot of coaching, who spends a lot of time outdoors. I'm very interested in looking at how we can use the wonderful resources that New Mexico offers with all the hiking, the Rio during the summer even, when it's full. How can we use all these assets to get children out of their homes, even though it's a pandemic, and kind of incorporate a type of learning that encourages all types of learners, not just people who can sit in a room and stare at a screen and pay attention and take notes. Additionally, with the pandemic, this is a great time to be kind of entering into school and identifying areas for work. There's a lot of work to be done on self-esteem and resilience building programs. I know currently there's been a huge spike in online enticement for youth. And it would be really, really helpful to work with parents and students to talk about what does digital citizenship look like and how does stranger danger go from the streets to online. Lastly, with that, I think one of the bigger areas too that could use a lot of work is looking at policy work and advocating for funding for the grassroots level. Here in New Mexico, or here in Las Cruces specifically, we have a lot of NGOs that work with, just a lot of NGOs that work with a lot of different communities, and they're always kind of flipping or running out of funding. So one of the bigger questions is how can we find ways or advocate for ways for us to increase funding and have sustainable long-term programs that the whole community can benefit from, and maybe the state even. But yeah, that is, I think I ended a little bit early, but that is kind of the gist of everything. I don't know if anyone has any questions or thoughts. Thank you all for coming. I know it was a lot of information to throw at in a short period of time.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ryan. It was wonderful learning more about your experiences in the Peace Corps. If you want, I can start off with a question. I have a couple questions here, so let me pick and choose. One of the things that I was curious about, we see now in the news, with a lot of the current immigration, crisis, that there seems to be certain forces that are driving individuals from Central America to come to the United States. And my question to you is, did you get to see or kind of get an idea of some of those drivers while you were there in Guatemala?
I would definitely say yes. And that's kind of what goes into the third goal. For me personally, one of the I feel it's a duty that I have to Guatemala after living there and having the privilege of living there for so long is sharing the experiences that sharing the experiences that I had working with locals, and especially youth, unaccompanied youth that are trying to come across, what that struggle actually looks like, especially now when these conversations are they actually in danger? I think one of the questions that I hear a lot is, is it really that bad that they would come here and be stuck in the areas that they're stuck in currently? And for a lot of them, yes. I still maintain contact with some of my students, and I currently have an ex-student who is kind of forced into maintaining the local bar cantina for her grandfather, and she's turning 19 now, so it's kind of a tough time for her, but her options are either she wants to continue school but she can't, so her options are either to get married or continue working in the store. And as a 19-year-old, very small girl, Guatemalans, I'm maybe 5'6", and Guatemalans tend to be like 5'2" on a good day. She's a tiny little girl who's working around grown men who are very, very, very intoxicated. A lot of times they carry around machetes coming to and from the field. So it's just, you never really know what could be happening. And this is just one village that I worked in, but there's a lot of, especially for young girls and children, there's a lot of potential risk as opposed to hope. I think the communities lack a lot of hope. So for Peace Corps, it's how can we go in and help foster the hope and opportunities, but it's really hard, especially with the
easier said than done, right? But I mean, if someone doesn't try, it's definitely not going to happen. And just as a follow-up question to what you mentioned, what are some of the limitations or some of the barriers that keep individuals like your former student from seeking further education?
With that, it's a lot of times it's finances. Local governments, even if they do receive funding that's coming from the federal government, there's so much corruption that the money never gets to where it needs to be. A lot of times it's just the genderized society. I mean, we throw around the word machismo there a lot, which is just men. Typically, if you have a daughter and a son, and the daughter might be more academically gifted, but the son is the one who needs to provide for the family. So he's going to be the one who is supported to go through school. as opposed to the daughter. That's not every single situation, but majority of them, that's what it looks like. So for women, it's especially difficult to get ahead. You have societal norms telling you I was in my early mid-20s when I volunteered, and the first question I always got was, are you married? Where's your husband? Where are your kids? So it's a societal thing. And that's why it's important to know the culture you're going into work with and have realistic expectations for what the impact is you can have.
Oh, I see. Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Any other further questions?
I have a quick question. First, thanks for presenting your experience, Ryan, and glad to have you in the School of Social Work. I lived and worked in the Philippines in the international school system, which of course is very different than the Peace Corps system, but I lived in a barangay community where, looking at reproductive health, like you had to have a prescription to buy condoms. And so, in my role, I wasn't really doing reproductive or sexual health, but you mentioned kind of finding these instances, especially in an evangelical community, where there's this discrepancy or conflict between maybe the work and the goals that you're doing and cultural or community traditions. And so I'm curious, if you could talk a little bit more about how you reconcile that in a way that's, culturally responsive, while also kind of sticking to some of the values that are guiding your work as a Peace Corps volunteer.
That's a really good question. For me, I worked for my students. And so I kind of asked them what they needed to hear, what they were interested in learning. And while it's a very taboo subject, that was one of the days or some of the sessions that I had students with their notebooks out kind of playing around. And it's a hard subject to teach in English, and it's an even harder subject when you're doing a condom demonstration with 14 and 15-year-olds in the room that have never had this conversation or even know what the words are in Spanish. It's awkward, but it's fun because we're learning together. A lot of parents know that it's really important. I'm not sure how many parents knew exactly what was going on. I sent out newsletters to families, and I talked with the principal and the teachers. I always had a teacher in the room with me whenever I was doing these. So I want to say I did it to the best of my ability and what was comfortable for the students. I don't think there's ever really a right way to go about it. It also depends on the person's expertise, I would say, and comfort level.
Awesome, thanks. I appreciate your acknowledging of just kind of remaining focused on who your actual, we in social work, we call them clients, but the population you're working with, and kind of focusing on their interests, maybe like in a more focused way, and kind of setting aside some of the other things that are impacting.
Do you have any other further questions? Okay, then. Well, just before we move on to Chris, Ryan, I just have one small question I wanted to ask. Did you already know Spanish before you went to Guatemala, or did you learn there?
I was lucky enough in undergrad. Well, I knew some Spanish. I went in at a moderate level, but speaking wise, I think I was definitely behind my peers. But I minored in Spanish as an undergrad before going, so I had that kind of bump above. Language learning is not my strongest suit, so it took a long time to get there.
No, I can imagine, because even though I'm a native Spanish speaker, I never went to school, so I just learned speaking Spanish with my family. So sometimes when we go further down in Mexico, I'll have conversations with individuals who are know very proper Spanish, and then it's even difficult for me to keep up with them. So I can imagine in your position, speaking with individuals who Spanish isn't their primary language, it must have been a challenge, but challenges are often rewarding.
Yeah, even here, I still get corrected on the dialects that I use, the different slang for this and that, because Mexican Spanish is different than Guatemalan Spanish. So I'm always learning. Yeah,
that's a whole other thing too, the regionalities. Alrighty, well, thank you again, Ryan, for your presentation. It was wonderful. Now we'll move on to Chris. Chris, if you want to just give a brief introduction, and if you need me to make you a co-host, so you can, if you want to share anything, just let me know.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Spurney, and I graduated from the MPH program in 2014. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Uganda and East Africa from 2006 to 2008, and I was a community health worker, and I was also an NGO advisor, and that's shorthand for non-governmental organizations, in case you don't know that acronym. Peace Corps is famous for its acronyms. So, and I just wanted to talk a little, I've been asked to present on a few different items than what Ryan presented. One is that Peace Corps most countries have to invite Peace Corps' presence there for their services. So Uganda knew that they wanted health volunteers and education volunteers and also work in engineering. So they recruited specifically in those educational areas before we could be invited in. So there's a lengthy process before Peace Corps enters any country. And then when you apply, it's a 27-month commitment. So you get 3 months of training on the ground once you get into the country. Usually there are locals that help provide technical assistance, cultural training, and language training. And you live with the homestay family that helps house you for the first 3 months while you're training. And then you can go to your site for 2 years, and that's where you live and work and do the majority of, most people stay there. Some people choose to extend for up to a year, which you can do as well. My path to Peace Corps is a little bit unconventional. I decided to join Peace Corps 10 years after my undergraduate degree in speech and hearing sciences. And it was something that I had always wanted to do. I think I heard about it in history, maybe in high school. I don't even remember where, but it was just something I'd always wanted to do. And they match your skills and your background and your health and they use a lot of matching criteria to decide the best fit. You don't get to choose where you go. So if you know that you want to be of service in a particular area, you have to be open to wherever they send you. So that's something to keep in mind for people who might be thinking about applying at some point. When I was placed at an orphanage in Kokonjero, which is about 2 hours outside of the capital city of Kampala. And I lived at a convent with the Little Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi. So it was a very interesting experience because not only were there cultural norms, but also religious and Catholic norms and also Muslim practices that we were trying to balance and weigh as we were teaching about health, reproductive health, and a variety of subjects. The sisters really wanted me to teach the kids and the youth about sexual health because there were so many children at the orphanage that, were getting pregnant very young. So my work was a little bit all over the place, some on the administrative side, helping with economic projects such as running their poultry unit, all the way to setting up epilepsy clinics and trying to get medication from the capital delivered to the site because transportation was a huge issue. And the children that lived at the orphanage, it was a home for children with special needs. So it was, transportation was a really big issue. But kind of some of the things that Ryan touched on, really you can't really have any expectations about what you think you want to accomplish. You have to show up and be willing to listen to the community, build the trust, and establish those relationships, which take time to build that trust and to not feel like you're the expert on everything, even though sometimes people will come to you and say, oh, Christine, Sister Christine, can you help me with, I really want to do this or I want to do that. And so I had to kind of balance out what the priorities were based on a variety of needs. And I think it was after that time that inspired me to pursue a master's in public health, because I wanted to look at health issues on a macro level, and getting that experience on a micro level was something very different, and being able to actually apply some framework to what I was already doing. That's kind of what inspired me to pursue a master's in public health. And some of the parallels in public health and what I'm doing now, I kind of touched on, like addressing company needs through community mapping, managing expectations and recognizing that change is slow. Applying for grants, getting a research grant, that can be a slow process. Getting a project implemented off the ground, running smoothly and getting the outcomes that you think you want, or to measure certain hypotheses that to test certain hypotheses, like that takes time. And I think that working in the Peace Corps gives you you have to be patient. There's no other way except just going with the flow of the community. Another thing that I think that Peace Corps also helped address regional issues here was because even though my primary responsibility was to the sisters and the residents of Providence Home, I also worked with community health workers on a variety of projects. And so going into the community, going into people's homes and educating them about what their child's needs may or may not be. There was still a lot of taboos and stigmatization around children that had certain disabilities. And so trying to balance education with cultural beliefs that they might be possessed, or that they might have, that's the best word I could use to describe it, to try to balance and respect what their beliefs, but also try to provide some education and insight that actually, if your child gets some physical therapy, they could build their muscles and they might be able to walk a little bit better. So I think a lot of those things helped me kind of prepare me for what the work that I'm doing now. And I specifically applied to the MPH program at NMSU because of the border region issues and because I wanted to do public health work in this area, and specifically around behavioral health. So most of the programs that I'm working on now is program evaluation, specifically around behavioral health issues. So I work a lot with Diana County Health and Human Services. I've worked on several Pasadena Norte grants, and really working with the community health workers here. I think having a good foundation and understanding of what that means and how vast that network is and how strong those relationships are. And to work in certain settings, you need to have that relationship already established and built to get any meaningful work done, instead of just walking in and thinking that you can just fix things. And that's not really the Peace Corps way. And just a little bit about the Peace Corps Fellows Program. It was started in the 80s was named for Paul Coverdell, who was a US Senator in Georgia. And he was the Peace Corps director in the late 80s. And one of the benefits of after serving Peace Corps is that you get 1 year of limited eligibility, non-competitive eligibility for federal jobs. And then you can also get financial assistance to different universities that offer some type of fellows program. Several people in my cohort ended up going into the foreign service. Many of them are doing immigration law now. Several are doctors, many are nurses. Several of us went into public health. So it really opens doors in a way that it just gives you a different type of foundation and experience that makes you really have a broader worldview and be able to bring that back to the work that you're doing on the ground now. It's their tagline is "It's the toughest job you'll ever love," and I absolutely believe it wholeheartedly. It absolutely was and is. So that's just kind of in a nutshell. I think those are the main things that you wanted me to touch on, Juan Carlos. I hope happy to answer any questions.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Chris. That was very informative. I have a couple of questions as well, but I'll start off with one. I'm gonna choose. So for someone who's interested in joining the Peace Corps, what's the application process like? Is it competitive, or that sort of thing?
It is competitive and it is lengthy, but it's definitely worthwhile. You have to complete an essay. You need to do a background check. You also have to get medical clearance, dental clearance, and then but they look at the entire applicant. So they saw, okay, you have a speech and hearing degree and you volunteered at the Red Cross. So that makes you qualified to work at a home for children with special needs. And you were a director at one place, so that makes you qualified to be an NGO advisor. So they try the best that they can to match whatever skills they have. So even if you haven't done any health work before, as long as you have, they look at everything. They look at the entire person. But it does take time. It's slow. You constantly want to log in and check your account. Like, did I get cleared for this? Did I get cleared for that? What other paperwork do I need to send them? But it is competitive and a bit of a lengthy process, but it's worth it.
I see. And for most individuals who join the Peace Corps, well, at least the ones that I know from here in our college, they're individuals who went to the Peace Corps after their undergraduate education. They go to the Peace Corps and then they're in our college to get that graduate education. Is that the common theme in the Peace Corps, or are there individuals in the Peace Corps who get their graduate education and then they go to the Peace Corps?
I think the larger proportion of candidates go after undergrad to help get them into the next. Well, some people just do it just to do it. That was my goal, was just to serve it. I didn't have an idea of grad school in mind when I applied.
Mm-hmm.
And then they do have advanced positions like Peace Corps response. So once you've already served in the Peace Corps, they have Peace Corps response positions, which are shorter in duration, but usually they're looking for more technical advising and support. And usually those require an advanced degree, not always. So.
I see. Thank you. Do we have any additional questions?
Ryan, did you want to add to any of that since I answered it? Did you want to add anything?
I guess the only other things that I can think of now is that you do have to be a U.S. citizen. You do have to have at least some sort of undergraduate degree before you apply, unless you have a lot of experience in a field. So if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and you've worked in a field for a long time, you may forego that formal training. But really, they want more diversity, from what I can tell, especially in age. But across the board, a lot of times it's the way it works, the way our system is here in the US, it's a lot of white people out of college whose parents help fund them, and they have less debt and more time to kind of give up and go. So Peace Corps is working on changing that. But here in the US, it's a cultural thing. So I think reaching out to recruiters and talking to recruiters about how you can do it, or how you can increase your odds of being able to go, is one of the more effective ways to kind of learn more about your specific situation, because each situation is different.
Mm-hmm.
I see. Thank you.
And once you've served, oh, go ahead, Jason.
You can go ahead and finish.
I was just going to say, and once you've served, you have lifetime eligibility to leverage the Peace Corps Fellows program. So there was a big gap. There was a 5-year gap between when I completed my service and figured out what I wanted to do, whether it was social work, nursing, or public health, and then finally made a decision to apply.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Chris, for sharing your experience. And I'm happy that you're the returning Peace Corps volunteer coordinator. And so we'll get to benefit from your expertise and experience. You talked about kind of this goodness of fit matching process that happens with the Peace Corps. And this may be like an obvious answer question, but I'm curious if like what that conversation looks at in terms of like your points of identity and how maybe it might not be safe to like be in a certain community. Like I'll just say, for example, like as a gay man, I'm curious if they have this conversations, there are certain countries where that's illegal. And so I'm curious if what that conversation looks like.
Yeah, I had a lot of friends who actually, I shouldn't say a lot, several gay and lesbian friends who actually did not support my decision to go. Because of the LGBTQ laws that do exist in Uganda with President Museveni. While I was there, the local newspaper printed a list of names that people who knew people, if they were gay, they were going to their houses and abducting them. It was a hard decision to make. And I had to weigh my my willingness to serve and want to live in another country and work versus the political views or the my friends would say backward views, but I wasn't going because of that. But it was hard, and there were some experiences where there were women who approached me and wanted to dance with me. We would be dancing, and there was one party where it escalated very quickly, where we were surrounded by a group of men that we did not feel safe. So I'd have one-on-one conversations with people in the community who would ask me because either they couldn't come out or wanted to come out or just wanted to talk about how it's so different here. And yeah, I don't have a really good answer for you. It was difficult, and it was definitely difficult for some of the LGBTQ volunteers in my group. definitely. They had to hide for, you know, who they were while they were there.
Thanks for sharing your experience on that.
Yeah.
Powerful.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think, you know, one thing from today's presentations that I've gathered is this theme of balancing personal views and the goals of the Peace Corps with the cultural values of those communities, right? Because it's, I mean, it can be very different.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, even politics, discussing politics with even my closest friends there was a risky move. And like what we're seeing happening now in Uganda is a perfect example. People are disappearing, candidates are disappearing, it's violent, it's dangerous in some cases. And so, you know, even when the president came to our village to campaign during that time, I was trying to get up close and my friends were like, stay away, like stay back, like don't get close, like just, you know, so they kept, I mean, once you build that trust, you could have one-on-one conversations, definitely. But it was private and it was usually after some time.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. Do you have any additional questions? All right, well, if we don't have any more questions, I think I'll just ask you one final question, Chris. I just want to know briefly a little bit more about the grants that you've worked in your role in our college. What was your role in the grants and what were the grants focused on?
Sure. So I work for a group called Crimson Research in the Department of Public Health Sciences. The director is Dr. Joe Tamaka. And we started with one project with the county. They wanted to look at their DWI program. And then that relationship grew over time. So right now I'm the lead evaluator for the assisted outpatient treatment program for Doñana County. It's just ended its 4-year term. It's was funded by SAMHSA, and it's a court order treatment program for people with serious mental illness who've been in and out of jail, psychiatric units, and the ER. So it's trying to reduce that recidivism, and so that's been one of the other projects. The other program that we did was through the Pasadena Foundation, which we went to Juarez, El Paso, and Las Cruces, and we evaluated several childhood education programs, and that was a fun project actually. What else? The tobacco cessation program through the Pasadena Foundation, using promotoras. We tout them on motivational interviewing. And then they went out and used MI in the community to try to help with tobacco cessation in their communities, which was pretty interesting because MI isn't used really outside of a clinical area. So that was kind of new and interesting work. And they were really excited to learn this new skill because they can be applied to anything, not just substances. So it's pretty interesting. A variety of things.
Oh, I see. Thank you, Chris, for sharing. Right. Well, if we don't have any further questions, I think we can end it here now. I'm currently recording this seminar, so once the recording is over, I'll send everyone the link to the recording if you want to use it in the future or share it with your colleagues. Thank you again for joining us today. And in addition, when I send the recording or the link to the recording, I'll send a short evaluation of the seminar as well. It won't take more than a minute. So if you please be able to fill it out, that would be much appreciated. Thank you all.
Thank you.